Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, con-specifics. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the organisers. Thank you to Thomas Westbrook for waking me up this morning in my hotel room after I overslept. And I can't blame it on the jet lag because it's only 2 hours away from the United Kingdom. Originally, when I came to this conference, when I was invited to the conference, I was invited to speak on the issue of meta-ethics more broadly. And it was only after that that I emailed Amir and asked if I would be able to talk about veganism instead. And he messaged back and said, you know, I'm not so sure. Veganism is quite an explosive topic over here. I said, it's explosive everywhere, and that's the point. And there's a reason it's so explosive and why so many people are hesitant to talk about it, and that's because it's what I would characterize as a moral emergency. Not only that, but I think it's the greatest moral emergency that we're currently facing. The issue of animal exploitation, I mean. Now, how dare I say this? There are so many things going on in the world, so many things going wrong in the world. How could I possibly say that the exploitation of non-human animals is more important than those? Well, the reason it's an emergency is because, yes, there are many things going wrong in the world right now. Human trafficking, to take one example. But go out onto the street and ask 100 people what they think about the issue of human trafficking. How many of them would tell you that it's not a moral abomination, and how many of them would even try to justify it to you? I submit that you get 0 people doing that, but go and ask some people on the street what they think of the exploitation of non-human animals, and you won't get the same kind of consensus. The crux of the point that I want to convince you of today, or help to elucidate, perhaps if you already believe, is that non-human animals are members of our moral community and deserve to be treated as such, whether we like it or not. Now, I need to begin by covering some misconceptions about what it means to refuse to partake in the exploitation of animals. And by that, I mean us as vegans. We don't eat them, we don't use them for entertainment, and we don't purchase clothing that comes from their products. Does this mean, for example, that we think that animals are worth the same as human beings? It's a pretty bold claim if we do, but fortunately it's not one we have to make. Instead, we think that these animals and their suffering is not worth what it is that we're exploiting them for. You don't have to think that a pig has the same value as a human being in order to be against killing that pig because they taste nice. You just have to think that that pig's life and its suffering is not worth as much as the human taste buds. That's the distinction that we need to be making. Also, it's not the case that being a vegan totally eliminates being responsible for the death of animals. When we grow crops in order to feed the diet that someone like myself would eat, we need to destroy habitats, we need to destroy wildlife in order to grow the crops. That's part of farming. What we're trying to eliminate is unnecessary suffering and cruelty. And as far as factory farming is concerned, it may as well be the definition of cruelty if you needed to explain what it meant to somebody who had no conception of the concept. Now, I don't make an argument from base moral principles. I don't give you a meta-ethical foundation and build up from that and tell you why you should care about animals. Instead, I make an argument from consistency. I take things that I think you would already believe and just see if the logic that you use to justify those beliefs also applies to non-human animals. I would submit that most people in this room already care about animals. Okay? I'm pretty sure you'd wince if I took a dog on stage, turned it upside down and split its throat, and watched it bleed out and made you watch it too. You probably wouldn't be all too comfortable. A pig is just as intelligent and just as aware as a dog is. All our evidence suggests that this is the case. But not only are we allowing it to happen in front of us, not only do we just not intervene when we see that death occurring, in fact, we funnel money into the industries that are causing it to happen. This is a uniquely economic moral emergency. Racism doesn't go away when you stop paying for it. But the exploitation of animals for food and entertainment and clothing disappears the moment that we stop paying for it to continue. I'd like to start as Peter Singer starts in his seminal Animal Liberation, which if you haven't read, I think should be mandatory reading for anybody who wants to take themselves seriously as an ethical human being. I read it far too late in my life, and I've been meaning to do it for a long time, and I put it off for a very long time, knowing that it would have the effect that it did, which is that it started me on my path to boycotting the exploitation of animals. I'd like to start as he does, in considering what is the moral principle underlying our approach to the equality between human beings, right? we think about equal rights and human rights, and we apply them consistently across human beings. And the reason that we have a conception of human rights is because we recognize that somebody's moral value should not be dependent on morally irrelevant concepts like race and gender and sexuality and religion. So what is it that gives us that? Is our equal treatment of human beings due to an equality within the human beings? Well, of course not. Human beings aren't equal, they're not the same. We all have different skin colors and cultures and proportions and eye shapes and all sorts of things, right? But to be anti-racist isn't to deny that these differences exist. To be anti-racist is to say that we recognize these differences, but we recognize that they're not morally relevant differences. We don't have to deny that a pig or a cow is totally different from a human being in many, many important ways. But in every way that these animals do resemble us, in their ability to feel pain, in their care for their children, in their sociability, these are the morally relevant characteristics which we use to ascribe moral value to human beings too. Just as the anti-racist recognizes the difference between the races but says that it doesn't make any moral difference to the way that we should consider them in our ethical framework, so does the refusal to exploit animals entail recognizing the differences that we share with these animals, but only taking them into account when they're actually morally relevant. On race, for example, we recognize that it's not a difference in traits that gives these people of different races the same ethical consideration. Thomas Jefferson, who of course is the man who first tried to get an abolition of slavery enshrined into the Declaration of Independence in its first draft, once responded to a man who'd written a book around the time in the 18th century about the intellectual and artistic achievements of black people. Right? There was a book written to combat racism, which said, look at the achievements and the contributions that these people have made. And Jefferson responded as follows, and I'll quote, "Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts that I myself have entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature." Right? Nobody more than Thomas Jefferson wanted to see it proved that these intellectual achievements could be made by black people. But this is what he says next. But whatever be their degree of talent is no measure of their rights. Because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not therefore lord or the property of persons of others. Right? Who cares if they're artistic and making contributions and intelligent? Who cares? That's not why we value them morally. And in fact, if it were, then we'd have a pretty repugnant conclusion. Okay? If you find the trait that you think it is that differentiates a human being from a non-human animal that justifies the difference in treatment, the logic would have to work as such. You would have to find the trait, the characteristic that those non-human animals don't have, that if a human being were to also not have, we treat that human being like we treat the animal. So let's say that the reason why we justify torturing pigs is because they don't have a similar sense of self-awareness that we do. Okay, if that's your reason, then let's apply it consistently. Take a human being and take away their self-awareness, but they can still feel pain. Take a severely disabled child who just doesn't have the self-awareness or has the same level of self-awareness as a pig. Are you okay with torturing them? I would submit not. I mean, maybe you do. But whichever you choose, you're either left with this repugnant conclusion that we should carelessly torture the disabled or the elderly or the most vulnerable of our society, or if you go the other way, you're left with the inconvenient conclusion that animal exploitation has to end now as a matter of principle, just as racism does, just as sexism does, just as ableism does, too. You don't need to see them as equal. That's the point that I'm trying to first get across to you. It's not about pigs versus humans, it's about pigs versus human taste buds. And no serious moral analysis can really think that those are even comparable. And not only this, also, the scientific community is clear. The contribution to global warming by the animal and agricultural industry far exceeds our transportation industries put together. Fully one half of the 79,000 tons of ocean plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is made up of fishing nets. A half of all of the plastic is fishing nets. It's amazing the kind of cognitive dissonance we're seeing as people begin to call themselves environmentalists and begin to really make strides to change the world in that area. People are willing to stop using plastic straws to save the fish. They won't stop eating fish to save the fish. It's absolutely absurd. If you call yourself an environmentalist, this should be at the top of your list of things that you care about. So why is it not for so many people? That's a question that we'll have to ask ourselves, and we'll have to ask those activists who make those claims. Not only environment, but also health. I mean, we all know that the science is beginning to show that not only is a vegan diet as healthy or as practicable as a non-vegan diet, but in many ways it benefits us too. Cancer Research UK recently published that it doesn't matter how much red meat you're eating, it will always be beneficial to eat less to reduce your risk of cancer. But here's the thing, right, and I mention these because they're important, but even if there were no environmental benefit to veganism, even if there were no health benefits, so long as it is healthy, which I assure you it is, there is already a moral imperative to go vegan. Right? When I found out about the environmental impact of veganism, when I found out that the single best thing you can do as an individual to help the planet is to stop eating animals and their products, I thought, great, this is really useful. But all it did was over-determine the fact that we have a moral imperative to stop exploiting these animals. There was enough there already to justify stopping that kind of behavior. Now, John Rawls, a political philosopher in the United States who Bill Clinton once described as the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, recognized that justice, if it's worthy of the name, has to be blind. If it's not blind, then it's not justice. And he realized that any reasonable person from behind a veil of ignorance who didn't know who they were going to be when they entered this planet, where they were going to live, what their conditions were going to be, would design a world, or want to design a world, that caters for those who suffer in our society as a matter of justice, as a matter of principle. And where is there more suffering and more excuses for its continuation than in the factory farms that populate our nations, like a stain on this earth? Chicks, baby chicks, at the moment of birth, put on a conveyor belt and thrown into a blender alive, simply because of the fact that they're male and they won't produce eggs for us to buy. Okay, not gassed. You think of the most cruel way that these animals could be put to death. Maybe you think they gas them or chop off their heads or something like that. No, they're thrown into a blender. Who knows how many rotations of the blades it takes to actually finally kill them? I hope it's not too many. Mothers forcibly impregnate and having their calves taken away from them, which brings the same kind of psychological distress that it would if you did it to a human. Living beings castrated by wrapping an elastic band around the testicles, waiting for the blood supply to cut off and the organ to decay. And if it doesn't fall off, then it's scraped off. Oceans ruined by the fishing industry and the useless waste of scraping the seabed without any prevention or even attempted prevention of collateral damage. Global warming catalyzed by the emissions of farm animals, chickens with osteoporosis from the lack of calcium due to the unnatural number of eggs that they're laying. Pigs having their tails cut off at birth. Why? Why might they do that? Doesn't seem to make any economic sense. Why might they cut off the tails of a pig? Well, I'll tell you, it's common practice to prevent them from cannibalizing each other when they're older, because they go insane due to the fact that these intelligent creatures are being kept in the most egregious conditions imaginable. And I'll remind you, ladies and gentlemen, all you have to do to end all of this, all that you have to do to end this intolerable misery, this unimaginable cruelty, this inexcusable contribution to moral, health, and environmental catastrophe, is choose something else on the menu. Right, that's it. Okay, choose a cotton jumper instead of a wool one. Choose empathy instead of cruel ignorance. It's not a difficult decision to make. I made that decision for myself the better part of a year ago, and I will never again allow my culinary convenience to balance upon the corpses of innocent members of our moral community whose eyes I never had to look into, but saw more pain than I will ever even be capable of imagining, so that I could eat a pizza topping. Clearly, I will never be able to make up for the suffering that I've caused with my previous dietary choices. But that doesn't mean things have to continue this way. If you refuse to partake in the exploitation of non-human animals, your stomach, your fridge, your mind, and your ethics will have never felt cleaner. If you turn down the offer of milk in your coffee and aren't afraid to say why, then your moral courage will betray a level of empathy far exceeding most of those around you, but exactly in line with what those beings that we share this planet with deserve. If you recognize your place in this world not as the unrestricted owner of animals, but an animal yourself, whose will to live and avoid suffering is mirrored in those who populate the factory farms, you'll have no choice but to stop eating them and their products. Not because you begrudgingly feel that you have to in order to accord with your rational moral system, but because if you spend even a moment thinking about this seriously, you'll want to, and you'll be a better person for it. As Darwin movingly observes at the end of The Origin of Species, there is grandeur in this view of life, recognizing our position in the animal kingdom and where and how that should prescribe us to treat other animals too. Don't consider it a problematic hurdle and a struggle to overcome, but the opportunity to be part of the greatest social justice movement that the world has ever known. As Peter Singer asks, when history looks back, do you want to be counted among the oppressors or among the liberators? You've got to make that choice. I speak a lot about justice and liberty and things like this, and I used to say in my videos and in my talks, for instance, that I oppose the oppression of ethnic and sexual minorities, of women, of atheists and political dissidents. Right? Not anymore. Now I just oppose oppression in all its forms. I oppose exploitation, not of particular groups or races or species at the expense of others. No, I just simply oppose exploitation wherever it occurs. And I think that we should all be doing the same thing. Ask yourself a question. If these animals that we kept in factory farms, that we keep in factory farms, could talk, do you think you'd go vegan? I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, they could talk you into it. Seems reasonable to suggest, but here's the catch. They do talk. Right? Not in the language of English, like me, but in the language of terror. Okay, I don't need to play you the audio from factory farms. You already know how visceral the screams of these animals are. And as our previous speaker pointed out when talking about low frequencies, even if you can't hear them yourself, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to feel them. And you should feel them when you know that that's what's going on. The way that these beings express their intangible suffering is necessarily undignified, but it betrays within them a level of dignity, the kind of dignity that's deserving of our moral consideration as a baseline of our ethical conduct, not some unrealistic logical extension of it. Again, as our last speaker said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I think we can all agree that this is accurate, but I can offer another corollary to that point, which is that extraordinary harm and mistreatment requires extraordinary justification. And we don't even have measly evidence, not even a shred of it, even for the most basic mistreatment of animals that we currently partake in. Okay, if you pride yourself on rationalism, pride yourself on refusing to leave out any sentient creature from your rational moral code. This is not difficult ethical philosophy. Does it get more basic in the consideration of our ethical conduct than to suggest that perhaps it's not a good idea to cause unnecessary suffering where it can be avoided, especially when the justification for this suffering is as trivial as sensory pleasure? Would we allow a sadist or a rapist or a domestic abuser to justify their disregard of the suffering of others because of their own sensory pleasure? Does it get more elementary than to oppose the torture of innocent creatures? The torture of innocent creatures. We don't justify torture. We don't justify the torture of our enemies, even when we have a good reason to do it. How can we possibly justify the torture of innocent creatures for no other reason than our own moral weakness? And you know what happens when I try to talk to people about this and I try to show them the footage, which I haven't even bothered to show you today, and I don't think I need to because we all know what's going on in these factory farms. And when I show people numbers like these that are going on behind me, I daren't even look at where they're at this point. They say, don't show me that. It will upset me. Well, so it should. I'm sorry. People claim that I'm proselytizing. They say, you're the kind of guy that hates proselytizing. You're always telling these religious people off for going around and preaching and proselytizing. No, I've never had a problem with proselytizing. My problem with the religious isn't that they're proselytizing. My problem is that they're wrong. If they were right, if I thought you were going to hell, then of course I would be doing everything that I possibly could to stop you from being destined in that direction. So you can ask all you like, how dare I force my views on you? Well, it's a good question, but how about this? I'll cut you a deal, okay? I'll stop shoving these inconvenient, let's say, moral considerations down your throat. When you stop shoving the tortured corpses of the innocent down the same hole, right? I'll stop caging you into difficult conversations. When you stop paying for people to cage innocent beings into factory farms. I will stop preaching, in other words, ladies and gentlemen, about the torture of animals when the torture ceases to exist. I'm sorry if you don't like it, I truly am, but you're really going to have to get used to it, okay? I won't stop making people aware of what's going on, and I won't pretend like your convenience is a legitimate excuse for this moral crisis. I will ruin the party every time, until I have to stop. Either because I'm dead or incapacitated, or because this party is finally over. And if this party of inhumanity and moral abhorrence is still going on when I leave this planet, then I'll feel like I've done it a disservice. As if I haven't already done it enough of a disservice by spending 20 years of my life here, contributing to the most ethically obvious moral atrocity currently in operation. In many ways, it's my shame and embarrassment from that time of my life that motivates me to deliver addresses like these. It's like looking for some kind of way that I can justify forgiving myself, because God knows that if those animals that I was responsible for torturing and killing had the opportunity, they sure as hell wouldn't forgive me, and I wouldn't blame them. But I don't blame you either. Okay, let me be clear about this. If you do contribute to this unnecessary industry, then I hate what you're doing. But I don't hate you. And I promise I'm not just saying that because I'm sure I'll probably have to sit at a dinner table with some of you after this. It's nothing to do with that. In fact, I think highly enough of you to suggest that you can do better. All right? You have the capacity to reach the moral standard that your intelligence prescribes. You have the potential here to be a moral example, every one of whom makes it slightly easier for the next person to follow in their footsteps. Just ask yourself, on what other moral issue would you permit the same excuses that we allow on the issue of animal rights? Taste, pleasure, and convenience, and societal disruption. On what other issues would we allow these kinds of responses to even be taken seriously? This isn't some kind of philosophical fancy or fun exercise in argumentation. This is the single greatest moral emergency of our time. Rid yourself of the superstition of human exceptionalism, of the myth of justified torture. Future generations will define you morally by which side of this issue you were on. Our current disregard for even being willing to consider the interests of non-human animals makes a mockery of any person who claims to be a lover of animals and any religion which claims to be their stewards. Looking at these numbers, the sheer numbers involved, it shouldn't take this many animals dying to make you take it seriously. But hopefully it will awaken some kind of empathetic faculty within those who haven't had it awakened already. These animals, these chicks and pigs and cows and fish, old and young, male and female, these animals are dying and suffering now, right now, as we speak, in this auditorium. And for what? Because they taste nice. Yeah, well, look, I mean, have that on your conscience. I certainly wouldn't want it on mine. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions. If we have time for any questions, I'd love to take some. If that's... Say again?
A vegan is kind of religion, because you believe in something that and you don't want to see the other sides. For example, how many Earths will need to feed 10 billion people only vegetarian?
Yeah, I'll tell you how many we need. We need one. right? We are already growing enough crops to feed the world 3 times over, but you know where those crops go? We feed them to livestock, right? We grow crops in the poorest areas of the world where they need food, where they're impoverished and can't afford to eat. And we take the crops from them and we feed them to cows so that we can eat the cows, right? This is the kind of moral absurdity that's required by this industry. And you're right, like there are serious environmental problems with veganism, and serious problems in terms of like making sure that we have enough resources and whatnot. But if you care about the planet that we have, if you care about the effect of soy farming on the planet, for instance, things like this, you have to recognize that the vast majority of these things are being done already to feed the cows and to feed the chicken. That's where it goes. We've got enough. As Philip Woolen once said, we have enough on this planet to suit everybody's need, but not everybody's greed.
The Brazil's force is especially for soy.
Yeah, and where does most of that soy go? It gets turned into pellets and fed to cows.
To Europe, because the Europeans don't want American soy with GM.
No,
Yeah.
80% goes to animals.
That's right. It's going to animals. Because listen, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. This is a massive problem. And I want to cut this down as much as possible. And the way to cut it down is to stop fueling it into the agricultural industry. It's as simple as that.
One last question.
Sure, down the front, yeah.
So you're vegan and it's based on ethics, not on, let's say, disgust.
Yeah.
As my wife is, she's just disgusted by me. How about lab-grown hamburgers? They take a sample without killing any animal, and they grow a hamburger out of it.
Yeah.
When they finally get around to manage the taste, because it doesn't taste as good,
No.
and the price, would you be eating it?
Yeah, of course. Well, this is so. For anyone who couldn't hear the questioner asked about lab-grown meat. We have to. This is where we have to be very careful to define what we're talking about when we speak about veganism. Veganism is not just the abstention from eating animal products, right? If that were the case, then someone who's in a coma would be a vegan. Veganism is a boycott. It's a refusal to take part in an industry that exploits animals, right? It's not about the end product of the meat. Like eating roadkill probably isn't really a problem. It's about the treatment while they're alive. So if there's no suffering involved in the production of the meat, then that's no problem. Like you say, your wife, if she's disgusted by it, then it's your prerogative. You can choose whether or not to eat. And this is the key point. This is the point that's often made against vegans. They say, look, let me eat what I want to eat. You eat. It's personal choice what you want to eat. It's like, yeah, live and let live only works if you are really letting live. So in the case of lab-grown meat, I can take it or leave it. I don't really mind. But the implication that so many people make, like you seem to be doing, where you say they haven't quite got the taste right, and I'm not saying this is what you've done, but people say, well, they haven't got the taste right. When they get it there, maybe then I'll eat it. It's like, yeah, it'd be great if we could replicate the taste of meat, and so people who were struggling and missing meat, I miss a pepperoni pizza, could have that experience. Sure, yeah, that's great. But it shouldn't take that. Right? There's already enough to make you go vegan. There's already enough in the moral argument, and if that doesn't do it for you, then how about the environmental argument? And if that doesn't do it for you, then how about the health argument? And if that doesn't do it for you, then I don't know what will. So yeah, I'd have no problem with lab-grown meat, but I think that it doesn't even need to come up in the moral consideration.